Muted.
Ben has graciously allowed us to share this recording afterwards should we desire to listen to it again. All right, so to get started, my name is Carrie Schaefer. I am the president of the Rocky Mountain chapter of the STC, and I think many of you already know me. For those who don't, welcome, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. Ben Woelk, our presenter, is from the STC Rochester chapter, and he is given this presentation in slightly different form before. It was at the STC Summit last year and was quite well received, so I'm really excited that we're able to present it again for the Rocky Mountain chapter. Ben is also the editor of the latest issue of Intercom, which is very exciting. It is exploring ideas surrounding personality type and work style and leadership. He's also an expert in information security. I hope that's the right buzzword, Ben. And has many years of experience in technical communication and also in leadership. So this should be an excellent presentation from Ben. Also, just before we get started, I do apologize to everyone for the confusion about the start time. If we were starting at 6 Central, I'm very sorry. I think we might have a few people that won't make it just because of that. All right, I'm going to unmute everyone. If you have any comments or questions, you can chime in. Oh, one other thing I almost forgot. We do have a door prize today. Please feel free to chime in with questions as we go, either by unmuting yourself or in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat during the presentation. I think whomever is the most communicative with questions during the presentation, we will award the door prize to. It is a 50% discount on registration to an STC learning session. So, all right. Any questions from the crowd? I will take that as a no. And I'm going to mute everyone except for Ben. Ben, go ahead. You're welcome to get started.
Okay, great. Well, excuse me. Thanks, Carrie. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in, I guess, for the presentation tonight. I feel like the pressure is really on now that Carrie said it's going to be an excellent presentation. You all will have to judge that for yourselves, obviously. This presentation is a little bit different for me because typically when I present, I talk about subjects or I talk about things that don't have a lot to do with me. When I did the presentation at Summit last spring in Anaheim, I found it quite challenging because I was talking about myself, which as an introvert is not something that I'm very comfortable with doing. But I found that doing that seemed to open a lot of doors, and I made connections with people that I really had not expected to be able to do. So it was a pretty awesome experience. So a little bit about me. Maybe I can get this thing to actually move on slides, so give me a second here. Okay, good.
It's moving, just to make sure.
Okay. Yeah, it's moving. It's all about exactly where the mouse is. Okay, so you can read about me. I don't see much point in going all through it. The basic gist of it is I have a very eclectic background, and this doesn't even have the former doctoral student in early modern European history part on it. So I've really been all over the place and didn't start out in technical communication, but kind of meandered my way over there as my doctoral program kind of ground to a halt once I got my all the dissertation status. And during that period of time, my wife, Marilyn Woelk, had started a technical communication firm. And I went to work with her and found out I was fairly decent at it and had a string of clients, worked primarily with Fortune, what were Fortune probably 100s at the time in Rochester. I'm not sure we have anything that's that big anymore, but I did work with Kodak, with Xerox, with Fuji eFilms, with EDS, a number of the companies that were local to us. So what I've discovered over the years, and I think I've known I'm an introvert, and obviously people who know me know I'm an introvert. But what I've found is that learning more about myself and learning more about introversion and specifically around temperament types, which is kind of what we talk about in the February intercom that I guest edited, which I do encourage you to read because it's really it's exciting for me, but I think that content's really, really good in it also. But anyway, I really am an introvert, despite the picture of me standing up with Alyssa Fox. I think we were doing, oh, I'm drawing a blank on it, the Grease tune, the John Travolta tune, and Olivia Newton-John tune, which I can't, Summer Nights. So that was us doing Summer Nights at Summit a couple of years ago. So what I've found, though, is that I am an introvert, and I'm also a leader, and learning about my introversion has really helped me understand how I am a leader and what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are as well. And as you can see, what I've got on the slide there, this self-understanding and learning what my skills are, I believe has really made me a better leader and, certainly more effective. So during the presentation, I'm going to talk about what an introvert is. I'm going to talk about how introvert strengths apply to leadership. And talk about how I made it work for me, which is that scary part where I talk about myself. And I'm going to talk about strategies that I think will probably be useful for you in the workplace and in life, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. It's really getting to know yourself and knowing what really works well. And I would say I do not mind being interrupted during the presentation. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And if it's appropriate, we'll address them then. If not, we'll address it later. But please feel free to chime in so you can get your door prize if nothing else.
And I will be monitoring the chat so that Ben doesn't have to. If any questions come in, I will pop them up as needed. But you're also welcome to unmute yourself. You should have that ability if you want to chat.
Okay. So we're going to talk about extroverts first, and yeah, this is spelled with an A, and I've seen it extroverts and extroverts, but extrovert seems to be the preferred spelling. And what I want to do with this slide is I'm talking about the characteristics of extroverts and really what makes them different. So you'll see there are a number of pictures there, everything from Bill Clinton to a solar array to skydiving to a picture of the Earth, which I don't remember why that's there, but we'll pick that up shortly, and a large auditorium. But some of the characteristics about extroverts is that they are very concerned with the outer world of people and things. They're very interested in what's going on around them, and they don't tend to be as introspective. Now, I will say one thing. I will probably generalize everything during the course of this presentation tonight. So I'm sure there is something you're going to disagree with, but just bear with me for now because I recognize that this is a giant roll-up, and we're really, kind of trying to give us some overall categories that we can talk about. But in general, extroverts are much more concerned with the outer world of people and things. They tend to be very active. That's the skydiving picture here. They have a breadth of interest. They can be interested in a lot of different things, active in a lot of different causes, activities, recreational activities, interests, whatever it is. But they tend to have a breadth of interest and not necessarily a deep interest in any one thing. Also with extroverts, many of them really prefer to live it or experience it and then understand it. And I've found this especially true with my son, who is on the Myers-Briggs. He comes out as a champion, and he's very passionate, very excited, but it's not good enough for him for us to tell him what something is like or how exciting it was. He has to experience it for himself. So for him and his extroversion and his champion temperament, it's really, really important to get right in the fray and get really involved with things. Extroverts may also tend to be reward seekers, and I recognize this comes across as a little negatively. I'm not trying to do that. But they are often motivated by external rewards, and sometimes they seek fame. And yes, there are introverts who will seek fame also, but for extroverts, it's a much more obvious thing to observe. And probably one of the real key things, and we'll talk about the differences, that for an extrovert, they re-energize by solar panels. And what that means is that for an extrovert to go to a party an event with lots happening, lots of people talking, lots of excitement, lots of activity, that energizes them. And they become more and more energized the longer they're there. And obviously to a point, when you're at a party for 5 or 6 hours, the energy is going to drop off, period. But in general, they are energized by being around other people. And I've heard the statement that, if I can get it right, that extroverts are bored by themselves in both senses of the word, both by being just around themselves and not being excited about themselves, but also just bored when they're not around other people. And that was really awkwardly put, and I'm so glad this is being recorded. Let's see. So let's talk about introverts a little bit. Different set of pictures here. And if this was a group meeting where I could see everybody, I've asked you all what the differences were and what you're really seeing, especially after I've talked about extroverts. But in general, introverts are more concerned with their inner world of ideas and impressions. So while extroverts were outwardly focused, introverts tend to be inwardly focused. And a lot of the time for non-introverts, the assumption is that if somebody's quiet and not saying something, that there must not be a lot going on there, kind of oh, they're quiet, nobody's home sort of thing. But for an introvert, they have a very, very rich thought life, and there could be all sorts of conversations going on in their head, essentially, but they don't always externalize it. Another facet for introverts is that they tend to have a depth of interest. Now, for extroverts, I mentioned a breadth of interest, and what that means is while an extrovert might kind of dabble in various things, and again, I'm generalizing again, an introvert may have a very specific depth of interest. For me, the way this worked out is I have had hobbies. I've been musical at times in my life, but it's always been a case I've always kind of dived really deeply into whatever I'm doing. On the music side, I played French horn, but then I got into a Renaissance ensemble and started playing all these different esoteric instruments because it was more interesting to me to get more geeky in a sense about the instruments. In terms of hobbies, I do model railroading, which for whatever reason I'm still embarrassed to tell people that, but I do model railroading, but it's not enough for me to have a train that runs around a tree. I want to model Dearborn Station in Chicago in 1957 with all the different passenger traffic that goes in and out. And the idea is not only that I'm probably obsessive about it, but that I really am interested in that depth of research that goes with that and trying to basically replicate a piece of the past. Introverts are usually also very motivated in terms of thinking about thoughts and concepts. Now, a lot of this work is built on the work of Susan Cain in a book that she published in 2012. I think she generalizes things a bit too much, but generally, introverts are more interested in the whole thought life and abstract concepts. A little more complicated than that, but we'll see if we get into that later in the presentation.
Hey, Ben, let me interrupt.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say we had a question from Lori in the chat about ambiverts, which I actually haven't heard that term before, but I'm assuming it's something in between. So if you know about that, perhaps we can tack that on somewhere in here.
Yeah, let me finish this slide, and then I'll talk about ambiverts and what I think that really means. Not that I'm an expert, but introverts tend to be inwardly directed. We talked about extroverts being externally directed. Introverts more what's going on inside them rather than what's going on outside of them. And the other big piece is that introverts re-energize by recharging. And we talked about extroverts energizing kind of like solar panels. When they go to a party, they get more energized. It builds their energy level. For an introvert, when they go to a party, typically the longer they're there, the more drained they're feeling during the course of the evening. And if you're at a party, what you'll see is that there will be a bunch of people clustered in the middle of the room, probably talking fairly loudly. Those tend to be the extroverts. Around the sides of the room, you'll see pairs or maybe 3 people together in more quiet conversation. And the introverts are almost kind of naturally drawn to the edges of the room. One of the big challenges for introverts is making small talk. We're quite able to talk at length for hours about a subject that we're really, really interested in. But trying to do small talk is a very painful thing for introverts because it just seems very awkward to us. Now, what's interesting in terms of the depth of conversation that we could have with people in introverts presenting, an introvert can be a very, very effective presenter. And it's interesting, some of you know Elisa Bonsignore, who is a colleague of mine, and she's on the board for STC this year, and she's an introvert, and she also put an article in the Intercom magazine on introverted entrepreneurship, embracing your introvert skills. Now, what's really interesting is that Elisa is a runner, and she runs all the time, and one time she was doing a presentation, she had a heart monitor on, and she said during the presentation, everything was great, everything was really solid while she was presenting. As soon as it got to the part where she had to answer questions and think on her feet, the heart monitor went wild, and it said it was like she was running a sprint. She just got so nervous from having to not be able to have that prepared material. Now, in terms of the ambivert question, I don't really think there are ambiverts. I think it really, for me, it really comes down to that, how do you re-energize? If you find that you need quiet time, maybe get away with a book, watch a movie, binge on Netflix or something like that, and you feel energized after doing that, you're most likely an introvert. If your energy comes from being around people, and if you're not around people, you start dragging because of that, I think you're more extroverted. But the one thing I would say, this is a spectrum. This is not like somebody is solidly on the introverted side, so we certainly know people who are, or if somebody is solidly on the extroverted side. So it does tend to be a spectrum, and people will find themselves at different points in there, and I hope that addresses it some. So let's talk about introverted strengths. So we've got 2 real-life figures and 1 not real figure, and I'll let you all decide which is which, obviously. But what you see, all of these are introverted characters, and yes, Sherlock Holmes wasn't real, but Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the way he portrayed Sherlock Holmes was very much an introvert who did a lot of deep thinking to figure out to looking at the clues to figure out how to solve the cases. Einstein, quite clearly, depth of interest, also really kind of a breadth of interest also, I guess, but he was very research focused, very internally focused. Steve Wozniak was the quiet side of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but without Wozniak, there never would have been Apple computers for Steve Jobs to sell at all. So they had strengths in terms of that they were able to go into a depth of interest and dig deep and research and conceptualize and invent things. Now, the premise when I put this presentation together back in the spring, and one I did presented a few years ago on becoming a powerful leader, embracing the introvert within, or empowering the introvert within, is that we're living in an extroverted world, at least in Western society. What you see in business schools is that most of what they try to turn out are extroverted leaders. They're very in front, take charge, make decision type leaders. The pictures on here, Dale Carnegie. What's interesting is that up until the late 19th century, America was still pretty much an agrarian society. So people lived in their small towns, and they lived and they worked and they died in their small towns, and they were around the same people all the time. And what the studies have shown is that a lot of the kind of character building books that people would come out with at that time all had to do with moral fortitude, being a strong example, that sort of thing. As people moved to the cities, they started working around people they had not grown up with. You know, there was no comfort level with the people. They did not know their coworkers. And it was about this time that Dale Carnegie started his work, came out with his book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it was all of the self-help books at that point in time really started to be more about how you could become popular, how you can make friends easily. It was more in terms of how to develop your social graces than it was maybe a moral fiber type of thing. The third picture on here, well, the picture to the right on here is Tony Robbins. I do not know how many of you are familiar with him, but Tony Robbins is an extrovert and does these huge rallies where they've got, you know, pretty much a cheering section, and it's like a monster pep rally, and people are jumping up and down and screaming. And that's a very extroverted environment. For introverts, for me, I would want to crawl away from there as fast as I could. The other picture on here has to do with Wall Street. And some of the studies that Susan Cain cites in her book, what they talk about is with the crash in 2008, that for many, many years that the market had just been building, building, building. And when you have stock brokers or traders, you have some that are more conservative, which tend to be which is more of an introverted characteristic, and you have some that tend to be risk takers, which is more extroverted. What Cain found in the research she looked at is that because the stock market kept growing and basically people's risks were being rewarded over and over and over again, the conservative traders tended to lose ground or lose their positions, and the very extroverted risk-taking traders got more of the positions. And there's some thought around the market crash that part of what happened with this, I know it's more complicated than I'm presenting it, but part of what happened is that you had a group of investors who were almost much more heavily weighted towards risk-taking than they were towards trying to do any kind of conservative portfolio. So the thought was that she talked about was that had an impact in terms of why we had a crash in 2008. And of course, that doesn't get into the mortgage crises and all of that sort of thing that was going on as well. But it does touch on the fact that if the market continues to grow and every time you take a risk, it's rewarded, that you're going to take more and more risks. And I think the thought is that's what you see in terms of what happened during that time. So this is actually, I'm going to ask a question, and this will give people a chance to contribute, and I'm not really seeing the chat well, so we'll see how this goes. But what makes a good leader in your view? Why don't you take a minute and put in the chat what your ideas of what a good leader is, and we'll see what you've got, assuming I can see it. If not, Carrie can read it to me. So what makes a good leader?
You can also probably unmute yourself if you prefer not to type. You are being recorded, so all my ums are being recorded for posterity. It's really embarrassing.
Yeah, I always hear nothing but the ums once I listen to a recording. So
I'm glad I'm not alone. We have a comment from Janice. Leader listens to both people and the situation.
Okay, that's good. Somebody else, and that is good. I'm not just saying it for the sake of saying it. What else do we have?
From Joe, we have a leader delivers results. From Ms. Frick, communicates well and cares about his or her people. From Lolita, advocates for employee work-life balance. From Lori, trusts their people.
Okay, great. And let's see.
And one more, couple more. Can get the information about the situation and then actually make a decision. Stands up for employees or their people. Serves those they lead. I like that one. Serves those they lead.
Yeah, and I'm gonna love that one as well. So what I've heard from almost all of you is well, I'm assuming a good number of you are introverts, so you probably wouldn't have turned into the presentation anyway. But what I'm hearing are as much introverted characteristics as are extroverted characteristics of leaders. So I'm not hearing anything about the dynamic take charge person in front. I am hearing, what Dan's got here about serve those they lead. To me, servant leadership is pretty much the greatest type of leadership there can be. But the pictures that we have here, Abraham Lincoln was an introvert, and no, he didn't take a Myers-Briggs or anything like that. But he was known as an introvert. He was known to be halting in his speech, and yet he was a tremendous strategic thinker who was able to hold the country together during the Civil War. Gandhi, another introvert, very quiet. You have the whole idea of the enormous change that happened in India, which Kerry just got back from, but the enormous change that happened in India because of the passive resistance, not standing up and yelling and arguing for people's rights, but that passive resistance of just, resisting until things changed. I don't have the slide here, but also in the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, who rode the bus in Birmingham, I believe, she was very much an introvert. She was the last person anybody would expect to take a stand, and she wasn't vocal about it. She just took the stand and led by taking that stand. And you had fiery preachers, for civil rights at that time, but then you had somebody like Rosa Parks, who was a very quiet witness of what they were trying to accomplish. So she was also a leader. But my argument would be that, I think you all have come up with very good examples of what makes a good leader, because I think that taking the time to listen to somebody, making strategic decisions, the results part of it's obviously important. And being a servant leader are very key things in terms of leadership. So my leadership journey, and this is the part that gets awkward for me, and I took out the pictures of me as a little boy because they were just awkward for me to look at. This is actually the house I grew up in. This is a farmhouse in Florida. This is nice and let's see. No, they hadn't put, the house has become a museum, and they've put air conditioning and walkways and all sorts of things around it. But essentially, this is the house I grew up in. 23 acres of orange groves, which we actually did not own those groves. But my nearest neighbor was probably a good half-mile away, and was a guy, I think he got married when he was 16, so not the best role model to be around. But one of the big questions about the whole introversion extroversion thing is how much of it has to do with nurture and how much of it has to do with nature. I grew up very much in a place where I didn't have the typical neighborhood experience, if there is such a thing. I spent a lot of time reading. By the time I was in second grade, I think I pretty much read through everything in the house, and I wanted something else, and my mom gave me a copy of the Odyssey, and 3 days later I had finished it. And this is as a 7-year-old or 8-year-old or whatever. Of course, I didn't get any of the names right. So it's, like Penelope instead of Penelope, and who knows how I managed to butcher the other names. But the point is that I was much more inwardly focused at that, even at that young age. Now, high school, I would have been among the geeks. I'm sure that, I don't think we were using the term at that point, but I was definitely not among the varsity football players or something like that. It's not who I was. And my whole time growing up and going through high school and college, I had some leadership experience, but I was very shy and reticent about it. Honestly, didn't know what to say, if anybody, had anything much to say to me about what I needed to do. But what happened is that, and this is not a commercial for STC local chapters, but it should be. What happened when I got into my professional life, I got involved with STC Rochester chapter, and I joined the chapter. Year into it, they asked me if I would be the program manager, and I said yes, kind of reluctantly. But the idea was that I would have all sorts of great ideas about who to bring in for programs, which may or may not have been the case. But so I was program manager for a year. I was program manager a second year. And they asked me, well, will you be on the ballot? And I said, yes, I'll do anything besides vice president, because the vice president role in Rochester is our Spectrum Conference co-chair. So sure enough, when the ballot came out, I was listed as the vice president candidate. So I didn't argue about it, and I ended up being kind of thrust into leadership at the VP level. There were two of us that made it a little bit easier. And the year after that, 2009, 2010 in STC is when they reworked the dues structure so that it was actually reflective of what things actually cost instead of the $50 a year they'd been charging or whatever it was. And when that happened, STC lost a lot of people. And our Rochester chapter, I think, had been up over 200 people, and we're not a large town. And it dropped to about 120 people the next year. And we lost most of our corporate memory in the sense that all of the people who knew how to do things had left. So my first year as president, I was thrust into a role of trying to figure out what's going on, what do we need to do. And what I discovered about that time is when I started paying more attention to the Myers-Briggs, Keirsey temperament analysis thing. And after taking tests, I found out, oh, I'm an INTJ, which is introverted, intuitive, thinking, judging. It's usually portrayed as a mastermind on the internet memes, and it's actually usually the evil emperor type in the internet memes as well. But what I discovered, and this is, for me, I don't know why this is the case. I had to read that I could be a good leader to understand that I could be a good leader. And it's a failing that I've seen, several times with myself over the years. I had done technical communication for years, but I felt like I had to have a certificate to prove that I was a technical communicator. And I did the same thing on the information security side. So for me, for whatever reason, I have to have this piece of paper. Now, assuming any of you make it to Summit, I'm doing a spotlight talk on Follow the Yellow Brick Road, a leadership journey to the Emerald City. And I'll be talking about the different character types and what that means about leadership, but I am definitely the scarecrow. Absolutely the scarecrow, where it's, if I only had a brain. So, but once he got his diploma, he was smart. And I kind of feel like I'm kind of a little bit that way myself. So I grew through community leadership, wanted to give back to the society, saw the struggles that we had and other chapters were having, and ended up joining the Community Affairs Committee, which I didn't even know it existed at that point. I just knew I wanted to do something to help leaders, help leaders grow, help them tackle the problems that they were facing, and help them succeed in that. So we've been very successful at Rochester, and I obviously can't take the credit for it. I do the documentation for the award, which I will take credit for that piece of it. But we went from not being involved with any of the Community Achievement Awards to being Community of the Year in 2013 and again in 2016. And we've managed to programmatically build a team of leaders so that we are able to do things well and still get along with each other, which is the amazing part, and kind of grow together. And part of that does come about from the INTJ mastermind planning thing, where I've made I've not been the president the whole time, but I've helped in terms of making adjustments about what do we need to do to stay viable. And that went from everything to we're going to increase our geographic area, we're going to pull leadership in that are not local to Rochester, and it has helped us grow and be really strong as a chapter. So that's pretty much the end of my STC part of the talk, except that I did run for director and was elected for director and served an amazing term from 2013 through 2015. Great experience. So I'm an introvert. I'm basically shy, or at least I used to be, but I've managed to become a director in STC. Now, granted, we don't have the biggest pool to choose from, but it was still a stretching experience for me. So what drives me? Why do I want to be a leader? It's something have asked myself, but for part of the being an INTJ, and I know I'm going back to the Keirsey, and please read the intercom and you'll understand more about it. Going back to the Keirsey temperament theory, INTJs, that mastermind type, really does want achievement. And I think that's why I was pursuing a doctorate, why I pursued certification in information security. It's that goal where you've got to constantly reach higher and higher and really drive yourself to be, as good as you can possibly be. In terms of what specifically drives me, if I see gaps, I tend to run right towards them. I'm not a person who sits on the sideline and says, oh, that's a terrible gap. I'm hoping somebody will step up and fill it. If I see a gap, I tend to run towards it. Now, that is not necessarily the wisest thing to do, and I have a consistent problem with committing to do too many things, volunteering in 2 organizations, and not even including my work stuff. But if I see gaps, I want to do something to address the gap. It is really critical to me to make a difference. It's not, for me, it's not okay to kind of just run through the paces and do what everybody else has done. I want to make a difference. And it's not with the goal of, oh, look, there's Ben. He stepped in and he made a huge difference. It's because I really care about the organizations I'm involved in, and I want them to be better after I have been there and worked in them than they were when I came in. So making a difference is a really critical piece for me. Practicing servant leadership, which Dan referred to earlier in the chat. To me, there is no greater leadership than being able to empower others and coach others and mentor others into being the leaders that they can be. And I'm fine with them getting the credit. I love being able to look back on a series of people I've mentored over the years and seeing how they have far outpaced me and will outpace me in terms of their achievements. And more importantly, I think of the difference that they can make where they do serve. And again, the whole pursuing excellence thing, it's not okay for me to do things half done. If I'm going to do them, I want to do things right. So these are the kinds of things that really kind of drive me as a leader. And then I'm also competitive, which can be a good thing, but it's not always a good thing. So for me, I want to win at whatever I'm doing, and which means if you're going to play Words with Friends or something with me, get prepared for a battle, because I am absolutely playing to win. I don't play just to play. And again, not saying that's right or that's wrong, but it's something that drives me. Now, what has helped me in terms of leadership, understanding what I do well and understanding what my weaknesses are, which I certainly have a plethora of weaknesses, what has helped me is really starting with small successes. Doing the simple things, doing the program manager job, which was helping somebody organize programming during the course of the year, and seeing that went well. Putting my hand to other things and seeing that those went well as well gave me these small successes. And once you start getting small successes, you're able to build on those and accomplish more. Understanding introversion was key to me. Susan Cain's Quiet book was an absolutely transforming read for me back in 2012, 2013. Those of you who have not read the Susan Cain book, what she has basically done is look at introversion in American society and helped a countless number of introverts understand that they are not handicapped people in the workplace, that they're not disenfranchised people, but they have very, very strong strengths as introverts, and they help fill out a team. Not saying that they're better leaders than extroverts necessarily, but they tend to make more, I'd say, considered or reasoned decisions, but they will take the time to think through things and not feel like they've got to jump right in with a solution. So for me, understanding introversion, understanding that I need to process in order to give the best answer I can possibly give was really important. That gets into understanding how I communicate best. I have gotten much better about this, and people at conferences do not believe I'm an introvert at all, but I do not like having to think on my feet. I am much better if I can sit, I can draft my thoughts in an email or something like that and rework them however many times until I'm saying exactly what I want to say. So for me, communicating best is, one, is delaying responses to things, telling my manager, I can give you an answer now, or if you give me some time, I can give you a really good answer. I know that I need to not just jump right in with a solution to something. I also communicate better in writing than I do verbally, and I don't say nearly as much in writing. The other thing that I found helpful was taking a Myers-Briggs assessment. There are a number of them online. I've got links to them later in the presentation. But just understanding that personality type has helped me understand strengths and weaknesses. The other thing that has been really useful is having other people take it as well, so that you understand how to better interact with them, and what will work with one person is obviously not going to work with somebody else. But if you have this Myers-Briggs and this other person is an INTJ as well, you're essentially talking the same language. If they're an ESTP, which I think is an artisan, which is focused very, very differently, pretty much on getting things done without the introspection, I have trouble working with those people. But understanding that's why, that's who they are and what drives them makes that easier as well. And I know that I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining how I came to a conclusion. I just want to provide the information. So where I am still weak, and I probably could have done 10 or 15 slides on this, but we're going to keep it to one slide. So I do not like conflict. One of the typical traits of an introvert is that they don't engage in conflict. They do not like it. Part of it, I think, is that fear of I'm going to have to think on my feet and speak immediately and, maintain my composure and everything else. But I don't like conflict, and that means that I avoid conflict. Now, that is not necessarily a good thing. I do find I'm much better standing up for other people than I am standing up for myself. But overall, if there's a way to avoid a conflict, I will do it, and sometimes to my detriment. I'm often, not that you can tell from this tonight, but I'm often reticent when I should speak up. It's that same thing where I'll let other people talk, especially if I think they know more than I do about a subject, without contributing much at all. I took an American history class in my doctoral work. I had not taken any American history in college before that. I probably said 2 words the entire semester because I felt like everybody there knew more than I did. So I just did not contribute like I should have. So I see the question in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. That was what I was going to bring up.
Okay, so can we talk about how introverts avoid conflict in the workplace and how we can be better at dealing with it? One thing that I've found, I've already talked about how I avoid conflict in the workplace, so that's definitely something we'll all understand. In terms of better at dealing with it, I actually finally took a Crucial Conversations seminar this fall, which really helps you understand everything that goes into a conversation and how to have a conversation in an environment that reduces the stress, but also understanding kind of what story you bring to the conversation, what story the other person may bring to the conversation. And I've found that for me, this is last fall I took this, I found that this was really helpful for me in terms of these stressful work conversations. And for me, the stressful conversations are when I'm talking to our VP, who's a very black and white person, and is an INTJ. And unfortunately, we don't have time to dig deeply into this. I had a coworker who was a security engineer, and his personality type was such that everything had to be black or white, period. He had checklists for everything. For me to be able to function well, I have to have a gray area in which to operate. once things have become black and white, I am bored stiff with them, and I'm looking for the next problem to address. And I think I've gotten off the answer that I was trying to give with this. But I think the key thing is learning. I think if you know more about the person you're going to have this crucial conversation with, understand where you're coming from and where they're coming from, it lessens the stakes. It does not always make it easy because, unfortunately, we can't avoid all conflict and can't avoid all difficult conversations. So in terms of how to approach that, I would say take the time to really think it through, and so that you have some idea of what your goal is going into the conversation, so that you can keep your eyes on that goal, but also not to get in a situation where you're having to defend yourself and think on your feet. I know this isn't a very good answer, but I do not know how to avoid conflict completely, even though I try to, and I hate conflict in the workplace. So like I said, this is a weakness, so I don't have necessarily great ideas on this. The other problem I have is that I tend to overanalyze things before I start things. Now, I am better about that than I used to be, and the one thing about the INTJ personality type is that we are consummate planners, which is where they get the mastermind idea from. And not only do we make plans and backup plans and backup plans to the backup plans, we're also able to move forward and make adjustments in our plans as we're moving. So while there might be some analysis before I start in a direction, once I'm moving in that direction, I am fully capable of abandoning whatever plan that I originally had if I know it's not working. I tend to be very pragmatic. But being overanalyzing before starting is an area where I'm still weak, and as I said before, I'm competitive, and I recognize that as a large weakness in a lot of sense too, because it's not always about winning, much as I'd like to think it is. So I can be very hyper competitive, and that can be a detriment, as I mentioned before. So for everybody, and if there are questions, please feel free to raise them as we're going through here. I don't want to drone on. Terms of day-to-day strategies, and I had some interesting conversations with people at Summit last year after I did the presentation. Even if you're an introvert, you need to network. You need to stop avoiding events. Now, the cool thing is, networking isn't about going up and introducing yourself to as many people as you can and getting a business card in everybody's hands. Networking is about making one or two really strong connections at an event. And if you're an introvert, look around the edges of the room. Those are the other people who are uncomfortable being there, and go up and talk to one of them, and you may find that you build a marvelous friendship and have all sorts of things to talk about. So you must network. You have to build a network. You need to be able to have people who can support you and vice versa, and stop avoiding events. Go to the edges of them, but stop avoiding events. Understand how you work best. I've mentioned the Myers-Briggs several times in here. Take the Myers-Briggs test. Take a DISC inventory, which I don't like as much, honestly. Do some emotional intelligence classes. Find out more about how you work best, and as much as you can, control your work environment so that you are in a situation you can work best. Now, I recognize where many companies have gone to this open office setup where there are people gathered around a table. For an introvert, and probably for some extroverts, that is a hellacious place to try to work and get things done, because it's so easy for you to be interrupted. The recommendations I've seen around that, and luckily I'm not in that situation now in my career, but the recommendations I've seen is to somehow carve out that space for yourself. Bring a plant in, that you can set on the table, bring something else in, just so you can kind of get that office space around you. Get headphones so that you can screen out the calls, and maybe get some kind of sign up so people understand, hey, I'm trying to work, don't come up and chat with me all the time. Another day-to-day strategy, let others know how you process. It's really important that your management and your coworkers understand, if you're an introvert, what that means in terms of conversations you'll have with them, ideas that you'll share, the ability to be creative even, honestly. If you need time to think through things before you speak, if you need to draft things on paper or on your computer, obviously, before you come up with an answer for something, talk to your manager about it. Let them know that they can get good work from you if you have to give good answers immediately, and again, they may not be good answers immediately, but they will get better work from you given if you are able to work in the way that you do best and how that you process best. Leverage social media. I welcome any of you all to connect with me on, well, Twitter, as much as Twitter is a connection. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of those platforms. Social media is pretty much the introvert's playground. It also seems to be the village idiot's playground at this point in time. But in terms of the introvert's playground, it gives us time to think through what kinds of things that we want to put out there and craft our messages. Just making sure I didn't mute myself. Other strategies, communicate in multiple formats. Find the things that work best for you, that show that you most effectively communicate, and use those vehicles. And the last thing is, make sure that you recharge. It's interesting for me because I'm the only introvert in my household. Our daughter's living with us right now. Both my wife, my daughter, and my son were all very extroverted. So recharging for them is, oh good, it's the evening, let's go out and go to a party, let's go to a concert, let's go out where a lot of things are happening. For me, as an introvert who has been in the workplace all day, the last thing I'd want to do when I get home is go out right away. I need that time to just dwell, to be quiet, to focus on things, and that is how I recharge. If I don't get that time, I suffer from it. I suffer from it probably physically as well as mentally. And I'm coming up on a 11-day straight stretch of 2 conferences back to back. And I will be on my extroverted style of behavior that whole time, and I will be exhausted for weeks after I get done with it. But it's really critical that you recharge. And if you're an extrovert and you recharge by being around people, by all means, get out and go, get around people. So where do I think you all should go from here? Get to know yourself. I already talked about personality assessment and DISC, trying to control your environment. Communicating your values. This is a really, really big thing for introverts in general. We are not good at stating our case and talking about all the great things that we have done, partially because we probably don't think they're great, because we always know where they could be better. But communicate your value. Find a way to do that, whether it's a weekly summary of your accomplishments or something you're doing monthly. Just make sure you have some way that you're communicating that upwards to your management, because management tends to reward those who are more visibly active than they do the introvert. Jana, what is DISC? I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but it's essentially a workplace behaviors analysis where they find out whether you're a dominant personality type or I'm going to get the letters wrong because they've changed it to be more politically correct over the years, whether you're dominant, whether you're more classification oriented, whether you're a get along person, which is a yes. It's basically a corporate tool that they use to try to figure out how teams can function best. Thanks, Carrie, for putting that up. And overall, leverage your introversion. Be proud of it. You have got amazing strengths. You have abilities that are in many ways untapped because people do not understand your ability to think deeply on subjects, to come up with innovative ideas, to really be that great person in the background who helps everybody else succeed. Leverage your strengths. Learn your strengths and leverage them. So for me, when I came out of Summit, this was interesting because I actually tried to do follow-ups afterwards and ensured that I actually made connections. That conference and that presentation and talking about myself, as I said, it was a very threatening, scary thing to do, but I also found it to be very transformational for me. And what I did after the conference was I reached out to several people, Carrie's one of them, who I met at the conference or who I actually did not meet, but who had signed up or had indicated interest in the seminar I did, and followed up with them. And what we did is we used a tool called Slack. We created an introverted leadership forum. We've had book discussions around the Susan Cain book. Carrie and I looked at the younger Tribes on Belonging book, which is a really, really cool book about society today. And I was blogging. I kind of ran out of steam on that midway through the fall when things got too busy, which is what usually happens. But I started blogging, and I also took advantage of opportunities to get out and talk about introversion and introverted leadership. So I actually approached Ed Marsh about doing his content podcast, which was really awkward for me because I don't approach people and ask for anything like that. I had another friend put me in touch with Tom Aldis, who did a Thought Leader Thursdays, which I still think in my mind is a very pretentious name for something. But I did a webcast with him talking about introverted leadership. And I've started doing mentoring and coaching as well. So what I've found is that this interest I had in leadership and in introverted leadership has really become, maybe this is the next phase of what I do, life work-wise or career-wise, is I want to be able to get out and make a difference individually with people. And if you had told me that 10 years ago, or probably even 5 or 6 years ago, I would have told people you're absolutely crazy, because I'm not a people person. But I somehow have managed to forge some relationships. So I've done the speaking. I've got a 3.5-hour Revive and Thrive strategies for introverts in the workplace workshop that I piloted at the Philadelphia Conduit Conference last month, and I'm offering again at Summit. But what I'm trying to do, and it's not like saying, oh, look at all these great things I've done. It's more, this is an area of interest for me, and as an INTJ, I'm trying to lay the groundwork for how do I move into theirs on a career-focused type thing, and how do I take the steps. So this is kind of planning out my steps to move into this area of practice. So that's kind of the message there. The other thing, as Carrie mentioned early on, was really excited about the February intercom. I approached Liz Poland probably a month or so after Summit and asked, is there any way I can do an article on personality and temperament and technical communication? And she said, yes, you can do an article, but if you'd like, you can guest edit an issue. And so I immediately said, oh, absolutely yes. And then I had to find authors, which is a really, really interesting story, because I have only met probably 3 of the authors who I've gotten this intercom, but I have forged pretty strong relationships with a couple of them that I actually met through LinkedIn. And it just, through extended conversation and working on the articles that they were putting together, have established relationships with theirs. So it's been really cool. It's a great issue. I really believe that. And you will have a much richer understanding of what I'm, trying to convey in this little bit of a presentation here. So in terms of resources to look at, Susan Cain Quiet book, again, if you haven't read that, you need to read it, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. If you're an extrovert and you're reading it, try not to get too irritated with her, because she is trying to do something she sees as corrective for kind of the balance of where things are in society. Lisa Petrilli, The Introvert's Guide to Success in Business and Leadership, she actually gets to checklists and things like that about what you need to do and how you can move into being what she says is a C-level executive. So she's at a level I will never be at, nor really desire to be at. The Please Understand Me Too book, the Kiersey book, is about the temperament theory, and you find out about rationals, which is what I am, and actually Carrie is also, idealists, artisans, and guardians, 4 different major types with a lot of variations. But again, people work differently, and we're a lot more nuanced than that, but this really helped me understand myself. The scary part for me of the Please Understand Me Too is there's a section in there that talks about the gestures that INTJs use. And as I've been doing this presentation, I am sitting here and consistently putting my hands and, putting my thumb and forefinger together. And that is a gesture that INTJs typically use. And that was kind of a scary part. The other things are, take a look at the Young typology test. You can take one on human metrics. You can take one on Kiersey. There are a number of places, but that'll give you the groundwork around where am I personality type. If it's possible it's not going to come out really solid. I know, talking to one of the people I'm working with, when she finished doing the test, it was like, well, I could be this, I could be that, I could be this. It was 3 different things. And we started digging into it more, figured out what really resonated with her, and discovered her personality type and our temperament type, and we've been able to move forward with mentoring from that. So that's the presentation. I am happy to take your questions, and I may not have answers for everything, but thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Ben. Again, if you want to do questions in chat, feel free. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you're free to do that as well.
And how many of you know your temperament types? If you've done a Myers-Briggs or a Kiersey test, you could put that information in the chat. It would be really interesting.
Idealist. INFP. I'm an INTP, so similar.
Yeah, INFP is like a healer, and they can be very sensitive. Anyway, sorry, Dan. So, and Lori's an INTJ, and that's that INTJ evil mastermind thing.
Yeah. So there's at least 3 of you, and that's a pretty rare type, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, it is. It's like 2% of the population, so we really planned this out, and we just didn't tell anybody. But
that evil mastermind bit, right?
As I said, Lori, it's a spectrum in terms of how strongly you are of any of these letter types as well. So it's going to vary. So does anybody else have any questions at all? Hopefully you're all still awake.
Yeah, yes, I'm just typing.
Hi, Ben. This is Joe. I just wanted to thank you again. This is a really great presentation, and definitely going to look into all the recommended resources that you've mentioned, including taking the Myers-Briggs test. I just had one quick question. Could you tell us what your Words with Friends username is?
No, it's probably Ben Woelk. I don't hide very well.
Okay.
So
I'll try that.
I'm sure we can find a way to connect if we want to do that.
Sure.
The other thing I would say is that we have that Introverted Leadership Slack channel. If any of you are interested in becoming a part of that, contact either me or Carrie, and we can add you to the channel. It would be good to get some fresh blood in there, and we can get some discussion stirred up, because we're really good and chatty for about 6 months after Summit. And then, of course, everything has kind of dropped back a little bit as we, get through the weary part of our year. But I'm expecting things to perk up again after that.
I bet you'll get a lot of additional interest at the Summit as well. It looks like we've got a couple of questions that just came in.
Okay, I can't see those. So.
Okay, so Janice is more of a comment. She says, in the DISC, I'm a CSID, which means I always follow the rules. Jana says, I read your article in Intercom yesterday, actually, and I like the idea of having coworkers take a personality test so we better know how to interact together, but my boss kind of just cringed at the idea. Any suggestions on getting some buy-in on that?
It would be really interesting to know what your boss's personality type was, and why he's cringing. Christine Christensen, who did that, again, she attended the session at Summit. I still have not met her face to face, but I've talked to her for the last year. She wanted to see how her direct reports would do on it, so she had the ability to just ask them to do it. What is interesting is that anytime that I've talked about this stuff, anybody who kind of fits the artisan temperament type in Keirsey, they don't seem to have a whole lot of interest in this whole Myers-Briggs temperament type stuff at all. So it's interesting. I saw the one note that popped up in terms of where the tests are. If you do a search for MBTI or do a search for Keirsey, Keirsey, you'll find tests there. And there are a number of these. And what you'll find is that Isabel Briggs-Myers, yes, and it is Briggs-Myers, kind of did this work as a layman back, I believe, in the 50s, and came up with the initial idea of this test questions to help, figure out where people fit type-wise. The Myers-Briggs in the Keirsey thing use the same letters, but they treat things very differently, and I didn't realize it at first. It took me time to get into it. So I'd say my favorite is the Keirsey. I think it's deeper. The problem with it right now is that they won't give you all 4 letters. They'll only tell you when you get done with it whether you're a rational, idealist, artisan, or guardian, which if you know you're an introvert or extrovert, you can figure out that part. But the Keirsey book actually has those test questions in it as well. I think it does give you all of that. So that's kind of my favorite of the personality type test. The other thing is you'll find Human Metrics has one, which is pretty straight. There's another company called 16 Personalities that has one, but they've added a couple of extra letters to it. And it has to do with kind of how stable you are in that personality type. And I really haven't dug into it enough to figure out whether I think that's worthwhile or not. If I do a certification, which I'm considering, I will do it through Keirsey because it just made more sense to me than the other things are. And that may be because it was the first thing I read.
So can you repeat the name of that? Sorry, can you repeat the name of that, the favorite test, Ben? I'll see if I can find it and add a link to the chat.
Yeah, the favorite one is Keirsey. So it's going to be at Keirsey.com. Kate, I could put it in here too, actually. That would probably, if I can get the mouse over there. Okay, so. Forgot I had this ability. That should be where it's at. Fascinating reading about personality types and career choices and romance and family and all sorts of things. So it's really interesting stuff. Were there other questions? Because I don't know that we got them all. We may have.
I scrolled through everything, and I think you got most of them. There were a couple variations on the question near the bottom about which is your favorite personality test.
Yeah, Joe, drop me an email. It's Ben Woelk. It's ben.woelk@gmail.com. I don't hide well, so drop me an email and I'll figure out the words of friends thing. Depending on what your average score is, whether we want to play that way or not. I have Marilyn has a first cousin who just thrashes me. I mean, I win like 1 out of every 4 or 5 times with him, and that doesn't happen with anybody else. But it's awful. He just thrashes me. So.
Okay, cool. I've had people accuse me of cheating, so it's hard to find people to play.
See, I'm terrible at words with friends, just terrible. At all of those games where you have to think of a word with given letters, my brain doesn't work that way. I see the letters and I don't see words.
Yeah, so Boggle would not be a good game for you. Yeah.
Or Jumble.
No, definitely not.
I
always
think
admire people that are good at it, though.
Yeah, I've scrolled up. I think we picked up all the questions. Were there any other questions at all? And I do invite you, please, connect with me. I would like that. And there's all my connection information, which I should have put up before. But it's what I've found is that the conversations can be really rich and really rewarding. And I know even for Carrie and I this year, we've spent a lot of time talking, gotten to know each other well, and it's been really, really good. And as introverts, we may never have done that, if we run into each other face to face somewhere. So I do encourage you to connect. And hopefully Carrie feels that way too, or if not, she's being quiet.
Yes,
so
of course.
Sure what to think.
I was I was just debating whether to mention that we actually did meet face-to-face at the STC Summit last year, and were chatting during a rather boring vendor-led presentation that
wasn't working properly.
Yeah, it wasn't working properly, but we were probably kind of annoying as well as audience members. But yeah, I think it's the time we had a conversation about how our personality types were clearly aligned.
Yep.
Okay. Please still chime in if you have any additional questions. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording shortly and say thank you very much to Ben.